kind of discussion and so forth. And one of the things that I have taken in retirement is I take classes at Lebanon Valley College. If you live in the Lebanon Valley area for $105, you can take a class. So I sit in and take class and try to, make sure these professors do the right thing and not teach things they're not supposed to be teaching and all that kind of stuff. And John and I have become friends along with another gentleman named Matt Sayers. And so I thought John, being the historian, he could at least provide some input as he understands some of the history of who we are as a nation and how religion has played a part in that. I've been doing a lot of reading on some of the various people, but John has a professor at LVC for how many years now? 25. 25 years, okay. His PhD is on the steel mills of Pittsburgh and how the steel industry and so forth. So it's a fascinating book. I have not finished it yet, but I'm reading it. So, John, it's all yours.
It's been a long time.
Well, I will say that if you need sleep aids, you have trouble getting to sleep, Steel and Steelworkers, it's a great book that'll knock you out. It takes about a minute, maybe two, and then you just stay there. So, Greg asked me to talk about, was America founded as a Christian nation? So here's my little talk. So early Americans were very familiar with the idea of having a state religion or an official religion. That was the way it was in England. They had a state religion, the Anglican Church, and indeed the king or queen were also heads of the official church. It's that way to this day. Tax monies support the churches and paid the salaries of the ministers. And that was also the case in much of Europe. It's still the case in much of Europe. Now, translating the Bible, which is kind of Henry VIII, but translating the Bible from Latin into the vernacular, that is the English, turns out to be one of those things that just upended everything. Because as soon as ordinary English people could read the Bible in their own language, and about something like a third of English people could read and write, they discovered that there's nothing in the Bible about having a pope. There's nothing in there about having an aristocracy. There's nothing about the divine right of kings. And so all manner of things got upended. So when King Charles and Parliament had a falling out, new religious movements such as the Puritans, who you're familiar with, and the Quakers, who you're also familiar with, joined the armies of Parliament. By 1649, they ultimately deposed and then killed King Charles I. It's only after the Quakers lost, ultimately, that they decided, you know what, we're really a peace church. So at this point in time, they were the most radical of the armies of Parliament. And then there were other movements such as levelers and diggers who believed in a kingdom of God but required sharing of land, refusing to pay tithes, all rents, all that kind of stuff. So it was just a wild period. So once you get to the American colonies, they all had state religions. The southern colonies tended to be the Anglican Church. Most of New England was the Puritan or Congregationalist Church. Maryland for a time was a Catholic colony, and then it was switched back to the Anglicans. The Mid-Atlantic, that is, sort of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, didn't have a official religion, although office holding was restricted to Christians. So Pennsylvania's religious tolerance, led, as I'm sure you all know, like many Mennonites and other kind of sects come in and settle in here. So one of the things I just find kind of interesting is that even when there was a state religion, or there was political office was restricted to members of those religion, clergy were banned from holding office. And so I think that was, not exactly sure why that is. I suspect because, they were essentially a bureaucrat, but also had a lot of social authority. So all of this means there wasn't a single church anywhere in the Americas. The colonies were heavily Protestant, but they also disagreed about what was the one true religion. And it's funny that when the 13 colonies are joining together, they're trying to get other colonies. In particular, they go up to Quebec and they try to recruit the Catholics there to join in. And they basically, the Catholics took one smell at them and said, no, you guys are, you know, in the wrong religion, and we think we're better off with the King of England protecting us. So, but by and large, most of the founding fathers were what are called deists. They believed in a God, but were not advocates of a single church. So, as an example of this, Thomas Jefferson wrote his own version of the Bible, right? He went through and said, let me eliminate all the repetition, anything that looks like superstition. And I mean, it's just hard to believe that somebody would be an American politician and get away with this, but they gave out this version of the Bible. You could still buy it, but they gave it out to new members of the House of Representatives into the 20th century. So that's the deists. So in the Declaration of Independence, right, which Jefferson drafts, the opening statement refers to nature's God, and that's it. There's nothing about Jesus, the Holy Mother, saints, the Trinity, nothing. Referring to nature's God alludes to God, but avoids any mention of any particular religion. So then when you go later and you have the Constitution, about 15 years later, there's actually a bar on having any religious test or restriction for office holders. And it reads like this: the senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial members, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support the Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification for any office or public trust under the United States. So that's Article 6, if you want to look it up. And then the first of the 10 amendments that were attached to the Constitution bans any state religion, saying Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. So this is a long quote, but it's a good one. From 1790, George Washington, the first president, he's visited Newport, Rhode Island, and members of a Jewish temple write to him and basically say how excited they are and how they missed sitting down to talk to him. So he writes back, and this next section is a long quote from Washington. He said, the citizens of the United States have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind an examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protections should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under their own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. I have to look that up. That's Micah 4, chapter 4. And then, may the Father of all mercies, and that's a reference to 2 Corinthians 1, scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own time and way everlasting happy. So the line that gets repeated a lot from this is, everyone shall sit under the safety of their own vine and fig tree, and none shall be, there shall be none to make him afraid. So, what do we take from all of this? My view is that if the Founding Fathers had wanted to make the U.S. a Christian nation, they surely could have. They were familiar enough with state religion from English history and practice and from American history and practice. Instead, they explicitly banned the establishment of state religion or any religious test for voting or office holding. Many scholars have concluded that this protects religion from government and indeed has encouraged a much higher level of religiosity in the U.S. than in Europe. European governments have essentially encouraged religious monopolies, and the U.S. is a free market. So at the same time, and this is more a little bit after the founding, but in that first generation afterwards, Protestantism was certainly the dominant religious practice in the U.S. Pennsylvania in the 1830s mandated that when they created a public school, then children would be taught from the Bible, but the King James version of the Bible. And so the result were riots, as Catholics saw it as an attempt to forcibly convert their children. The militia was called out, several people were killed, and one effect of it beyond violent deaths was the creation of the Catholic school system, which continues to this day. So that's a sort of example of, even though there is no state religion, there's a kind of often efforts to kind of do things in the back way. And so I think this is the kind of thing the founders were trying to avoid. And history is messy. So Washington, who makes this very elegant testimony to kind of toleration, certainly did not extend the idea that every man shall sit under his own vine with his own fig tree, free from persecution. He did not extend that to either slaves, of which he owned a few hundred, right? That was not extended to Native Americans. And certainly throughout, particularly in the 1830s, there's a lot of, certainly when like the Mormon religion is created, there's just like massacres against them, lots of anti-Catholic stuff that goes on. But I think, anyway, so, sorry, I'm going to stop myself from starting to go down a rabbit hole. That's what historians like to do. So I would say much of the practice of American patriotism, what this scholar of the 60s, Robert Belloc, called our civil religion, has been infused with Protestantism. There's lots of appeals to God, although Eisenhower, for instance, said that God is whatever deity you think is you think best. I also think it's interesting that even though we have like this kind of Protestantism that's sort of an assumption, that many of our, if you think about it, many of our federal buildings, or the Lincoln Memorial, et cetera, they're monuments that resemble the pagan temples of the ancient Republic of Rome or the pagan democracies of Greece. So anyway, these are all the kind of ambiguities. So, and I can't remember if you asked if I would have questions for. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted, this is kind of I'm going to skip over. Was the U.S. founded as a Christian nation? But you may want to ask about that. Why did the U.S. ban official religions? Why was Washington so generous to Newport's Jews? And maybe why did he, make allusions to the Old and New Testament in his writing? I mean, they're just like snippets, but they're there. And then what would it mean if we truly were a Christian nation? So, that's it.
Your chance, ask some questions. Who has something you want to ask about? It's an important topic, so I'll talk a little bit more about it later. I think John alluded to it. Many of our earliest founders, I hate to use the word founders, because that implies that nobody was here before they founded it. You see what I'm saying? Because Native Americans were here long before we came. He mentioned deists. Deists believe that God created and then God steps out. It's a very impersonal. God is not a personal God like with Jesus. God creates, God steps out, and he watches us down, looks down and says, man, are they messing things up? Kind of notion. That was what the deists.
That's that nature's God.
Not right.
In the Declaration.
And that led to some of the, and John, obviously didn't have time to do it and everything else, but you can read any of these earlier persons of our history, and they're not consistent either in what they say.
Right.
They say one thing on one page, and you go someplace else, and they're saying something entirely different than what they said before. How about questions? What do you want to ask? This is your chance to, because we are right now in the midst of debate upon whether or not this nation, it should be a Christian nation, you know, with a belief in mostly an evangelical God, not even Protestant. What do you remember from when you were teaching, when you went to school?
I know you put your hand on the Bible and swear that you're telling the truth, the whole truth,
Truth and whole truth.
which leads you to believe that there, even though they may not specify that there's a religion, you use a holy Bible when you're doing that, and they've since kind of got away from that, maybe in the last, I'd say 2 years-ish, but prior to that, 20 years before that, I can guarantee you, you put your hand on a Bible and swore, and that's in our judicial system, right? So that's one of the arms of Congress, which, you know, there's 3. So I would say the fact that they say that there's not an official religion is inaccurate based upon one arm or branch requiring that on the Bible and on the actual Bible. It wasn't a Quran, it wasn't, you know, anything like that. It was the whole Bible.
Even the whole educational system has changed. We used to say Pledge of Allegiance, we used to pray the Lord's Prayer, we used to be able to, you know, have our Bible studies in school. We can't do that anymore.
We didn't have that when I was in school. Not a Bible study.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no.
Not when I was in grade school.
No, but you can have, as I understand it, you can have Bible study today, and it cannot be required,
Right.
it cannot be forced. It's to be like a club, like we take, you know, chess club, or you take a Bible club, and they're there on your own volition and not forced to do it.
We didn't have that option now.
No, well, we went through a period, I don't know if John ever went through, I went through a period where, you know, when I was even on Honesdale, where the school had release time. Kids could leave school early, come down to the church to have a study and so forth. That was permissible. Kids loved it because they got out of school at 45 minutes. They weren't happy about religion class.
Well, they had that up, they still had it up through COVID, and COVID knocked out so much.
Mm-hmm.
What, the release time? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that varies from, you know, state to state.
And school district.
The school district. For example, you take, and if you and I were living in Oklahoma today, Oklahoma's probably, at least what I read, John, and you may be different, is probably one of the most, a state that really wants to maintain, they're trying to bring, you know, one of the rules has been that every school must have the 10 Commandments on the walls. They must have this and that. I don't know if that's in the past or if it's refuted as being possible. But it varies from state to state too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a funny thing because I'm not that deep of a scholar of religion. Matt Sayers is always like, well, which version of the 10 Commandments do you want? Because there's multiple versions, so that's one question. But I know, like in England, they have required biblical classes, right? Because that's a state religion, and there, the evidence is pretty clear that what that does is it creates a very, very well-educated group of atheists. That it tends to, but because partly I think it's the official nature of it, and maybe it's that people aren't that inspired in how they teach it. I do know that, but I've also heard people say that once once you don't have Bible or religious texts taught in schools, which is really, I guess, the 60s is when that goes out, it sort of creates, you lose a kind of, as much as anything, you lose a kind of common language. And so I think increasingly we don't have, I know this from teaching, we don't have 3 channels on our TVs. You know, there's less and less that kind of binds everything together, or cultural frames of reference. And I see this at LBC, when I started 25 years ago, the students were very religious, and now they really, it's not that there aren't still very religious students, but there's not nearly as many. And I think that's not, I don't know, I mean, there's a lot of changes. There's all kinds of things that have changed, but that's a big one. And I think part of it is also Christianity is not, Christianity is increasingly defined as evangelical and very conservative. And so I think a lot of students, if they aren't really on board with all of that, they just say, well, that's Christianity, so I guess I'm not particularly Christian. And I think that's I think that's part of what the founders are trying to wrestle with, is they say, like, if you let one group or one interpretation dominate, but certainly in the 50s up, we had it. We also had segregation. We also had a bunch of things that I think, like I was reading a different book after I wrote this, and the person was talking about all the kind of, not just the anti-Catholic riots, but like burning a nunnery down, burning buildings down, killing people. And I'm thinking, my guess is nobody would be saying, well, that's a Christian nation, right? So we're okay with, and I think at least that's the way I think of it. You want common values, you want people to have a sense of ethics, but you don't want to I think you don't want any man afraid under their own tree. You want people to be secure in their faith or their lack of faith. But that's a very hard thing to do, right? I mean, so I think sorry, I know people didn't ask me, but I'll say it anyway, which is, I think the problem with Christian nationalism that's being promulgated now is that it's exactly the opposite of what Washington is talking about. It's an attempt to say, this is the correct way, and we will impose this on you. Whereas I think one way to view what Washington is saying is, that is the Christian approach, which is, everybody is going to be tolerated. We're trying to create a kingdom of God, but by doing that, that will only happen if people arrive at it themselves, or there may be multiple ways to arrive at it. That the Jews, being free in their persons to worship, that's part of what nature's God calls us to do. Now, why they didn't extend it to the Native Americans or to blacks in the South or any of that stuff is because people are people and we're imperfect. But that's what I think. I'm not sure what a Christian nation would look like. I mean, I know Greg has thoughts, but it's a genuine question. I'm not sure if you said, okay, we're going to be a Christian nation, what would be different? I mean, besides teaching the Bible in schools, what else would follow from that?
What would happen to all the Jewish people and all the Muslim people? I mean, you can't, I don't know.
It would just be like the way it is under Sharia law in the other countries, where the laws of the nation follow the religion. So for us, if we were a Christian nation, our laws would reflect the Bible. So like the views on abortion and pro-life, those would all be dictated by the government as opposed to the choices you have now. Because the way Sharia law is, like, you follow Sharia law, and if you violate Sharia law, the penalties are imposed as such. And that's the nation that we're in. So that would be the largest impact, I would think.
And then what interpretation? Because then you have somebody else saying, well, no, that's not right. That's an apostate,
one of the things about that, as I understand it, your Muslim faith in the Muslim countries, they're called theocracies. In other words, the government is run by God. God and government are coexist. That's never been historically was supposed to be the case. I think that's one of the challenges that we're now living in, that kind of ambiguity of.
Yeah. And people's understanding, I mean, the thing I always, because I teach the 20th century, that's really or since the Civil War, that's my bread and butter. And I always refer to like Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, who some of you may remember. So Gerald Ford was the first evangelical president, and Jimmy Carter was the second. And they were both pro-choice and supported the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. But they also, Carter was much more public about his faith. Gerald Ford never spoke about it. And I think it's partly just because he didn't have faith, he did. He just, in that generation, you just didn't talk about it because it was like, that would kind of cross the line into a state religion. And I think that's one of the big changes is that in the 80s, that kind of understanding of evangelicalism that people like Carter, and Carter, until he died, was a man of faith, but his version of faith, or Ford's version of faith, really kind of have been eclipsed. And I think it's like so old that we forget about it, unless you're old like me, or study the past like me. So I think all that just means that like people are, we're imposing on our. So.
Anyone else have something you want to? Thanks, John. I appreciate you coming and talking about it.
Thank you.
John and I have a lot of conversations and read different books that we. I conversed with him the other day about them. If you want to see some of this, what's going on in a different kind of context. Sometimes we look at our own world. It's hard to be our own context. It's hard to be not biased because it's our context. Deb and I watched the other day the movie Nuremberg, which is on Netflix. It stars Russell Crowe. He plays the part of Goebbels, who, one of the people who was in Nuremberg during the trial.
He was the air
marshal, second command. And so you read in there's talk about this kind of some of the things that are happening and so forth. A follow-up to this for those who are interested. On the third Sunday in April, we will be at Bucks, we'll be at Hill, which has that great stream. After worship, for those that are interested, we're going to watch a presentation, John has already seen it as well, of a sermon by Tallarico. He is the young man who just recently won the Democratic election in Texas, is running. He's a minister. He did a sermon about 2 or 3 years ago what he thinks Christian nationalism. Now, if you ask 4 or 5 different people, you get 4 or 5 different interpretations of what Christian nationalism a little bit. I think it's well done. He does talk about some of it, and we'll watch it for about 20. It's only like 18 minutes, and then we'll talk about and see what you like about it, what you hear him say. So because you hear a lot of that being expressed and talked about, and I've mentioned it several times. People have asked me, "Well, Greg, I don't know what is Christian nationalism? What is it where is that thin line between follower of Christ and what you believe, and then imposing, and how you deal with that?" So we'll watch that for those that want and discuss it as just another kind of follow-up to understanding more and more about this. I thank John for coming, being willing to come over and talk about it. He's got. Too bad if you lived in Lebanon County, you could take it. Most of you could take his classes, and they're wonderful. I've learned an awful lot about things like slavery and some of those issues that I just was, in understanding. If we you are Christian, why would you treat people the way we treated people? Why would you deny them their rights? That included half of the room, your women, who didn't get rights, didn't get elected to vote before, you know, and so, how does that work? And, you know.
Couldn't have a banking account or a checking account, which is just.
I just learned the other day, and I had never heard this before. And this really astounds me. In the former Central Pennsylvania Conference, at one time, when Deb and I got married, she would have been told that she cannot work outside of the house. That she had to stay at home, raise the kids, and she was not. What that has meant, the consequence, and that's long since changed. But a lot of the women of that period whose husbands have died, they never had their own pension and so forth. So we have a lot of retired women, a lot of retired widows who are facing real struggle financially because in those days, pastors didn't get very much. They don't have any, their own pensions themselves, so they ended up, and I just find it hard to believe that, you know, the church would have said at that point. But then again, when you interviewed for churches, they would always want to know, what's a pastor's wife going to, can she play the piano? Can she lead choir? Can we get two for the price of one? So, but, well, thank you for coming. I hope it's been a little helpful to you. I learned some more things. We'll learn some other things. Next week, I think we'll really reach out, bring some friends. I think they'll find the service. And then Hodge is going to sing as well for us, which we're very grateful.
Story of the three of us.
Yeah.
Don't you be taking any tomatoes.